And here we house part of the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection, which all boils down to meaning that I do all Lincoln all the time. If you get the opportunity, I encourage you to visit the Rolland Center here in Fort Wayne to explore on your own, or email us at lincoln@acpl.info to book a tour. Okay, we did start recording. Very good. So today we're going to talk about the Victorian phenomenon of the spiritualist movement. Specifically, Mary Lincoln's active involvement with mediums, seances, and a spirit photographer. She was no stranger to grief and mourning, as we'll see. The American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history, determined what nation we would become. Would we become the largest holder of enslaved peoples in the New World, or would we abide by our Declaration of Independence, where all men were created with an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? I think you know how the story ends, but at what cost? Approximately 750,000 lives were lost by the end of the war. During the time after the war, many grief-stricken families turned to a wide spectrum of coping mechanisms. One of them was spiritualism. Spiritualism at the time had an estimated 8 million believers in both the United States and Europe. Americans sought comfort in performing seances with mediums, knowing there was a better life for their loved ones beyond the grave and longing to connect with them. They also sought out spirit photographers to have their likenesses snapped with ghosts, grieving for those no longer with us in the mortal realm. Believe it or not, Mary Lincoln was one of those forlorn Americans. So spiritualism, which flourished in the 19th century, has been described then and now as a fad, a movement, and a religion, depending on the character of its adherents. For many dabblers in spiritualism, it was a fad. It attracted the curious, those interested in testing spiritualist claims, and sometimes those seeking to expose its practitioners as frauds. Abraham Lincoln could be said to be in this class. Adherents who saw it as a movement viewed manifestations of spirits as real and found personal comfort and meaning in that reality. Most melded spiritualist beliefs and practices with liberal Protestantism. Mary Lincoln was in this class. Many sought to spread its beliefs and practices as a source of comfort to bereaved family and friends. Adherents who found in spiritualism a new religion, true believers, saw spiritualism as an extension of the relationship between the individual and the divine promised by liberal or radical Protestant doctrines, such as the sanctity of the individual conscience and the, quote, inner light. However it was and is characterized, there is no doubt that spiritualism was an influential and controversial ism during much of the 19th century. And that influence and controversy reached from traveling carnival clairvoyants to seances in private parlors to the White House. And it would have considerable significance in the life of President Lincoln's wife and widow, Mary. Spiritualism began in a farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, near Rochester. There, on March 31st, 1848, two teenage sisters, Kate and Maggie Fox, heard strange rapping or knocking in the floors and walls of the house. The source of the sounds couldn't be found. The girls, and those they told about the raps, decided it was a spirit trying to communicate. The girls and their family and neighbors asked the spirit questions and received rapped answers. 1 rap for yes, 2 for don't know, and 3 for no. With some practice, the spirit could also spell and rap numbers. And with this action, the Fox girls sparked spiritualism. And indeed, women were key players in the inception and popularity of the movement. One scholar, Children Hamer at Concordia University in Canada, outlines in her 2015 thesis on the topic that, as, quote, a religious movement which catered to the specific needs of contemporary grievers, spiritualism responded to a population that had become dissatisfied with Christian conceptions of the afterlife. She continued, It democratized the afterlife. All were permitted entry regardless of their religious beliefs. This aspect appealed to women in particular who rejected the idea that their unbaptized children could be damned to hell. Spiritualism envisioned an afterlife which cared for those who had died young, soldiers, children, and the many women who did not survive childbirth, and allowed for continued emotional bonds and even growth post-mortem. Kate and Maggie's elder sister Leah was convinced by the girls' rappings and became their manager and a medium herself. Soon, girls claimed they could communicate with specific spirits for family and friends. As interest increased, the Fox sisters joined their elder sister Leah in New York City, where the three attracted widespread attention. Soon they were giving public demonstrations in lecture and concert halls and were holding private seances in darkened parlors. At these events, the spirits were manifested through the medium, who could sense their presence and interpret their communication. Seances provided an intimate setting for investigators to join the spirit circle and reach the spirits through the medium. There were some rules, or quote-unquote rules, with holding a seance. Participants would be sitting alternating male-female with a group of 12 or fewer, and participants would hold hands or lay them on the table. This image here is a wonderful lithograph from the December 30th, 1871 issue of Harper's Weekly. Interestingly, you'll notice that the group doesn't adhere to the usual prescriptions. It's a group of more than 12, and not all the participants are sitting alternating male-female. Others discovered their powers as mediums. Soon, mediums and investigators numbered in the thousands. It was most popular in the North, but there were also adherents in the South, especially in Louisiana and cities of South Carolina and Virginia, as well as Washington, D.C., as we will see. A spiritualist ideology or theology developed. It drew on earlier ideas of Emanuel Swedenborg and a variety of Protestant doctrines. It aimed at proving that the soul was immortal by communicating with spirits of the dead. Spiritualists saw contact with those beyond the veil as scientific proof of immortality. Spirit manifestations were viewed as empirical exercises under test conditions provided by the seance. In an age when Americans were struggling to understand the workings of electricity, magnetism, and the telegraph, spiritualism's spiritual telegraph was no more inexplicable than those things. For instance, sitting male-female equaled a positive-negative circuit, if you will, of a circle. Aside from its quote-unquote science, spiritualism also revealed divine truths about the afterlife and divine purposes for the living. Some circles began with hymns and prayer because spiritualists sought God as well as science. In religious terms, spiritualism was a revolt against death and the traditional Protestant doctrines associated with death. Spiritualists rejected death as a finality that annihilated the individual and cut the dead off permanently from the living. Instead, death was a transition to a new level of being that remained linked to life on earth. Spiritualists saw their beliefs as an extension of, even proof of, Christian beliefs in the afterlife and the workings of the Holy Spirit. Traditional Christians saw it as heresy because it rejected the doctrines of predestination, original sin, final judgment, damnation, redemption, atonement, and resurrection of the dead. Spiritualism denied the existence of hell and asserted that heaven was open to all. In fact, spirits continued to grow in grace after death. And heaven was not a place of endless worship by anonymous spirits of the chosen few. It was home, where family members knew each other and were reunited in paradise of middle-class domesticity. Children who died were cared for and reared until joined by their parents in their heavenly home, and heavenly family members could communicate with those left behind. Spirit manifestations maintained bonds seemingly broken by death. As the popularity of spiritualism grew during the 1850s and 60s, several types of mediums emerged. Some presided over seances and interpreted raps or other sounds made by spirits. Physical mediums moved objects as manifestations of the spirits. They usually levitated furniture. The use of planchette allowed automatic writing. Mediums produced words, essays, even books through their writing under control of a spirit. Trance mediums allegedly spoke directly from spirits, also under control of a spirit. The medium didn't know what she or he had said when the trance was over. Sometimes there were brief messages, whole lectures, sometimes communicated in languages the medium didn't even know. Spiritualist literature expanded with the movement. Theology, like harmonial philosophy, poetry, fiction, such as the extremely popular The Gates Ajar, published 1868, and also in pamphlets and periodicals like The Banner of Light. Spiritualism had tremendous appeal in 19th century America. Americans, especially the middle and upper classes, were preoccupied with death. Before the Civil War, most Americans died at home under the care of female relatives. A large portion of those deaths were children under the age of 5. So death was a presence in ways it's not today. At the same time, anxiety about death also increased. There was especially concern about children's deaths and premature deaths generally. Traditional Calvinist and evangelical theologies focused on the importance of salvation and the afterlife, and both theologies damned the unconverted, including children. Traditional consolation for the bereaved was acceptance of deaths as God's will and resignation to his way. 19th century Americans found both this theology and consolation increasingly difficult to accept. With cultural preoccupation with death, mourning rituals greatly expanded. There were strict rules for mourning apparel, especially for women, and activities, as well as the length of mourning. There was a publishing boom in consolation literature of all kinds, including locally published pieces by the bereaved, such as Little Eddy, which we'll talk about later. There was a rural cemetery movement as well, and Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield is an example. And undertaking grew as a profession. The Civil War, with its mass deaths, especially deaths of young men, brought sudden, premature death into hundreds of thousands of homes and intensified all these concerns. Americans increasingly adopted a view of heaven and the afterlife that promised reunion with loved ones and a familiar domestic paradise just beyond. There was an additional source of anxiety regarding death for middle-class mothers like Mary. Mothers were increasingly held responsible for children's health and religious education, for the body and soul of the child. Deaths of children often, understandably, left mothers with a nearly unbearable burden of grief and guilt and an unconquerable need to maintain a connection to the child. Spiritualism, of course, promised such a connection and ultimate reunion. It offered, in fact, immediate communication with the dead, children, soldiers, husbands and wives, parents and friends. Spiritualism essentially denied the reality of death as a parting. It even allowed the dead to console the living. The most common messages from the beyond were messages of comfort, assurances that spirits were happy and well, like, I still live. The Civil War gave spiritualist beliefs new resonance and urgency. Mediums, both paid and unpaid, did a booming business. Planchettes sold like hotcakes. The Banner of Light publication published a messages department of Voices from the Dead with messages from soldiers and from more well-known spirits, including Willie Lincoln. Mary Lincoln was likely aware of spiritualism before her arrival in Washington as First Lady in 1861. As a young girl in Kentucky, she had contact with beliefs among many enslaved peoples that the spirits of loved ones watch over the living. It's very possible that the idea was offered by her Black nursemaid, Sally, as comfort to a 6-year-old Mary after her mother's death. Mary also probably shared Springfield's interest in traveling mediums and clairvoyance, and in the town's one permanent mesmerist, though there's no evidence she ever consulted any of them. Her husband's election as president and her family's status as first family absorbed all Mary's attention during her first year in Washington. And although many of Mary's new acquaintances were more or less serious spiritualists, there is no indication that Mary was interested in spiritualism in any form until after Willie's death in February 1862. It is clear that the appeal of spiritualism for Mary was the comfort it offered her in her grief over family deaths. Mary saw these deaths, beginning with her mother's, as personal abandonments, and they were unbearable. Her mourning was intense, occasionally theatrical, according to some accounts, and ultimately permanent, like is popularly remembered about Queen Victoria. Willie's death sparked Mary's interest in spiritualism, but to fully understand its appeal, even its necessity for her, we must take a longer view. Her mother died of childbed fever at age 31 after the birth of her 7th child in her 12-year marriage. Mary was only 6 at the time. She lost her father, to whom she was close temperamentally, as educated, articulate, and politically engaged. Her grandmother, the family matriarch and a respected local power, defended Mary against her stepmother, with whom she did not get along. Then, Mary's second son, Eddy, born 1846, died, likely of tuberculosis, just before his 4th birthday. Third son, Willie, born 1850, died after Mary's great social triumph of reaching the White House, and Mary saw it as a punishment. She lost half-brothers, both in the Confederate Army, but was only close to one, the youngest son, Alec, and family favorite, but she couldn't officially mourn either due to their allegiance. Then her brother-in-law, Ben, married to Mary's half-sister, Emily Todd Helm, whom Mary and Abraham were both very close with. Her older brother, Levi, in the Union Army, had been close to Mary. And in the greatest tragedy of all, Abraham died after holding her hand when he was shot. She described him as her all. And finally, youngest son Tad, born 1853, died a long death of lung disease. In all, Mary buried 3 of her 4 children before her death in 1882. The Lincoln's first child to pass died just before his 4th birthday, as I mentioned, to Mary's great devastation. The couple had him buried in a local burial plot where he would rest in peace until the family's tomb was erected in Oak Ridge Cemetery after Abraham's death. There were no photographs ever taken of him due to his passing at such a tender age. A week following Eddy's death saw an anonymous poem published in the Illinois Daily Journal titled Little Eddy, as mentioned earlier. And it's worth noting that scholars have determined it was penned by neither of the Lincolns. I'd like to read it here. Those midnight stars are sadly dimmed, that late so brilliantly shone, and the crimson tinge from cheek and lip with the heart's warm life has flown. The angel death was hovering nigh, and the lovely boy was called to die. The silken waves of his glossy hair lie still over his marble brow, and the pallid lip and pearly cheek the presence of death avow. Pure little bud, in kindness given, in mercy taken to bloom in heaven. Happier far is the angel child with the harp and the crown of gold, who warbles now at the Savior's feet, the glories to us untold. Eddy, meet blossom of heavenly love, dwells in the spirit world above. Angel boy, fare thee well, farewell, sweet Eddy, we bid thee adieu. Affection's wail cannot reach thee now, deep though it be and true. Bright is the home to him now given, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. Then, almost exactly 12 years later, Willie's death from typhoid fever in February 1862 left both his parents grief-stricken. He had been, by all accounts, a smart, appealing boy, and Mary found him the child most like his father. She was inconsolable. The funeral was held in the East Room of the White House, but Mary was unable to attend and was only able to lay a laurel sprig on his coffin. She retreated to her room for weeks, refusing food and visitors and unable to control fits of weeping. She could not tolerate anything that reminded her of Willie. She banished the boy's playmates from the White House, and she even canceled all receptions and weekly band concerts for the rest of the year. Her elder sister Elizabeth came from Springfield at Abraham's request to help care for Mary, and slowly, over several weeks, she regained some control. But the family circle was painfully and permanently reduced. A copy of the funeral address that Reverend Dr. Gurley delivered at Willie's funeral service is in the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection. Mary personally addressed this copy, sending it to a friend back in Springfield. Gurley said that it is easy to see how a child thus endowed with an inquisitive, conscientious mind, an amiable and affectionate disposition, kind and generous impulses, and gentle words and manners would, in the course of 11 years, entwine himself around the hearts of those who knew him best. Nor can we wonder that the grief of his affectionate mother today is like that of Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they were not. As I mentioned earlier, Mary knew a number of spiritualists in Washington, notably Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles and his wife Mary Jane, who consulted mediums to contact their dead child. But the most influential to Mary was her dressmaker and confidant, Elizabeth Keckley. Keckley had turned to spiritualism for consolation after her son and only child had been killed in the Civil War. Belief in spiritualism and Keckley's companionship offered the same source of consolation to Mary Lincoln. By the summer of 1862, Mary was participating in spirit circles. We don't know exactly how many mediums Mary consulted after Willie's death or how many spirit circles she participated in, but we do know that as many as 8 seances were held in the Red Room at the White House, and at least one was held at the Soldiers' Home. In addition, Mary attended several seances at the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Cranston Lorry, well-known Washington spiritualists. They also attended seances at the Lorry's home and was especially fond of a young medium named Nettie Colburn, who conducted most of the seances the Lincolns attended. Colburn was a trance medium who spoke through a spirit called Pinky. Mary liked her so much that she even used her influence to get Colburn a job in a government office so she could remain in Washington. However, Colburn couldn't relate anything she communicated to Mary in private sessions because she didn't know what she said in her trances. Colburn later claimed to have influenced Abraham with her messages from beyond, which were witnessed by others. In her 1891 book, Was Abraham Lincoln a Spiritualist?, Colburn claimed that she and the spirits she summoned had influenced the president, especially regarding the Emancipation Proclamation and the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, and had advised him on wartime strategy and policy. Abraham attended many of these seances, partly out of curiosity and partly to see that his wife wasn't taken advantage of. The most famous of these involved the Lorry's daughter, the physical medium, Mrs. Belle Miller, who made a piano move and jump with Abraham Lincoln and 2 other men sitting on it, shown here. On another occasion, after a summer 1862 session with Lord Colchester, in which Willie's spirit communicated and thrilled Mary, Abraham had Colchester investigated by Joseph Henry of the Smithsonian. Noah Brooks, a journalist and friend, also sought to expose Colchester and succeeded during a seance in the White House. Brooks helped run him out of town. In addition to Washington sessions, Mary visited mediums on her extended trips to Boston and New York City during 1862. Both cities were centers of spiritualist activity. Mary sometimes received spirit messages from Army officers and warnings from mediums regarding enemies in the government. She reported these to Abraham. But her focus was on communicating with Willie and Eddy, with reconstituting the family that was her most important priority. She came to believe, as she wrote to Senator Charles Sumner, quote, "My belief is so assured that death is only a blessed transition to the pure in heart, that a very slight veil separates us from the loved and lost, and to me there is comfort in the thought that though unseen by us, they are very near." Mary was unusual in that her children's spirits also came to her in dreams, without the help of a medium. She told her half-sister Emily Helm, "Willie lives. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of the bed with the same sweet, adorable smile he always had. He does not come alone. Little Eddy is sometimes with him. And occasionally, her youngest and dearest half-brother Alec would appear too." Mary's mourning seemed excessive to some, and her resort to spiritualism caused gossip and opposition among some in Washington, including, naturally, the clergy. Yet for many months after Willie's death, Mary found more comfort in spirit circles than in the church doctrine of "the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." And though she never abandoned her church, she valued the consolation the spirit world provided. Indeed, she rented a pew at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church during the White House years. The anti-Lincoln spiritualist medium Fayette Hall published this illustration of Lincoln's so-called spirit cabinet in his 1902 pamphlet, The Copperhead, or The Secret Political History of Our Civil War Unveiled. The spirits are left to right: Romano, Wisdom; Priscilla, Bright Eyes; and the Aztec princess and favorite, Pinky, as well as old Dr. Bamford, all contacted through Nettie Colburn. Colburn is seated at the table, and Lincoln is at the far right. The pamphlet was a fiery condemnation of Lincoln. Hall wrote that Abraham Lincoln and his wife are now settled in life and ready to employ any means to accomplish their purpose. He went on, "I stated at the commencement that spiritualism was one of the chief factors in the management of our national affairs during the reign of Abraham Lincoln. I now assert that as voodooism was the chief factor and incentive that started Abraham Lincoln in the race for, so spiritualism was the chief factor in the nomination and election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency of the United States. Further, Abraham Lincoln has at last attained that position to which, with his own and his wife's united ambition, superstition, voodooism, spiritualism, abolitionism, and the current events which those elements have forced upon the country, but a position which to a man of honor and high intelligence under the same circumstances would have been particularly embarrassing, but which in his case he had only to drift with the current and wait further development. Ouch." In addition to consulting mediums, Mary Lincoln also read popular spiritualist-influenced novels, including The Disowned, comprised of 2 volumes by Edward Bulwer Lytton. This copy, and a copy of Lytton's Zanoni, also 2 volumes, both bear Mary's signature and are held here in the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection. Abraham's assassination in April 1865 left Mary stunned and unable to leave her room for more than a month. On May 22nd that year, as she finally prepared to leave, she wrote to her friend, Madame Bergmans, and bid her farewell. She wrote, "I go hence a broken-hearted woman, without my beloved husband, who was everything to me. I do not have the least desire to live." Again, she clung to the belief that the spirit of her loved one remained accessible and near, the belief that her vanishing family was not lost forever. She moved first to Chicago, and she spent some time at spiritualist retreats in Illinois and Wisconsin. Then she and youngest son Tad left for Europe in 1868 to escape the public scrutiny at home and to properly grieve. The two initially settled in Frankfurt, Germany, where Tad attended boarding school, then traveled across Great Britain. While in Europe, Mary moderated her views on spiritualism, perhaps in response to critics in Washington who were using her eccentricities as arguments against granting her a pension. In 1869, Mary wrote to her friend Sally Orne from Frankfurt saying, "I am not either a spiritualist, but I sincerely believe our loved ones, who have only gone before, are permitted to watch over those who were dearer to them than life. I should have lost my reason long ere this if I had entertained other views than I do on this subject." At the same time, she continued to read spiritualist literature and recommended Elizabeth Stuart Phelps's The Gates Ajar to a spiritualist friend in the United States. Mary and Tad returned to the U.S. in May 1871, and by July, Tad was dead. Mary had now lost 3 sons and a husband. Her eldest son was married and distant, and she was in poor health. She began several years of wandering, moving from health spa to hotel to spiritualist retreat. She spent time at a spiritualist center or colony in St. Charles, Illinois, and visited a medium in Monrovia, New York, known as Dark Parlor Country, who summoned 22 spirit faces for her, including Tad. She also visited a medium in Boston under an assumed name, though was very recognizable, where Abraham appeared and put his hands protectively on her shoulders. That experience led her to William Mumler, who had begun his career as a spirit photographer in Boston in 1861 as the Civil War was kicking off. Mumler claimed to be able to capture spirits on camera. He created spirit photographs of the living and the spirits of their loved ones. Spirit photography was promoted as a so-called science that could ostensibly prove spiritualist conceptions of the afterlife. After Mumler snapped his first photo with, allegedly, a ghost, local spiritualists glommed on to this new invention. Spiritualist newspapers spread the news far and wide, making Mumler an overnight sensation. Interestingly, there is some debate today about who was really the mastermind behind Mumler's camera trickery. There are 2 women central to Mumler's success. Helen Stewart, who owned the studio wherein Mumler purportedly stumbled upon his invention, and Hannah Green, who was secretary in the studio and later also a medium who summoned the spirits to appear for the photographs. Another theory has Stewart not as a second woman in the shop, but actually the alias of Green. And quote-unquote Stewart was a prolific photographer in her own right, who took ordinary portraits as well as spirit photos. Hamer, mentioned earlier, argues that Green was in fact the co-creator of the spirit photography method, or even invented it herself and taught the method to Mumler. Green and Mumler married in 1864 or 5. Regardless, Mumler soon took his successful business to New York City, and there he ran into trouble when in 1869, a journalist named P.V. Hickey lodged a complaint directly to City Hall against Mumler and his fraudulent photographs. City Marshal Joseph H. Tooker soon launched an investigation that resulted in Mumler being arrested and brought to a pre-trial hearing for fraud. The sensational case made the front page of Harper's Weekly on May 8, 1869, seen here. Ultimately, Mumler's case was dismissed because the prosecution could not prove how the photographer created his spirit images or that he had acted with intent to defraud. In the words of the presiding judge, the Honorable John Dowling, however, I might believe that trick and deception has been practiced by the prisoner, as I sit here in my capacity of magistrate, I am compelled to decide that the prosecution has failed to prove the case. Mumler was free to go, but his New York business was ruined. So he returned to Boston, where Mary Lincoln walked into his studio in early 1872. Despite the newspaper exposés, Mumler continued to attract throngs of customers, including Mary. As usual, she went using an assumed name, though Mumler certainly knew who she was. She paid in advance, $10 for 12 photographs, which is 5 times the going rate for regular carte de visites in the period. And she had her picture taken. The next day, she returned and picked up the photographs. Mary is seated with Abraham standing directly and protectively behind her, with his hands on her shoulders, just as she had experienced at the recent seance. The photograph was taken in Boston in 1872, 7 years after her time as First Lady, and a decade before her death. Indeed, it was the last photo she ever sat for. Mary treasured it and was convinced it showed Abraham's spirit. Mary had always been very picky about keeping only the most flattering photos. And this one is perhaps not so flattering by some accounts, but in this case, she didn't care. She showed it off to others at a boarding house in Waukesha, Wisconsin, that summer when she went there to take the healing waters and to visit mediums. She also gave Mumler permission to make copies of and sell the photo. One scholar wrote that spirit photographers are shaped by the desires of the intended viewer, thus making them highly evocative and intensely personal objects. And such was the case for Mary Lincoln. She found great comfort in the photo, believing that it proved her husband's continuing care for her. It's unlikely that either Mary or Mumler realized that the image would be historic. A famous last photograph of Mary and Abraham Lincoln and the most famous Mumler image. Mumler made additional prints and sold them. It was a very profitable business, though only a handful remain today. Mary and Abraham never sat for a photograph together in life. Mary would say that they'd look ridiculous together, with her at 5'2" and him at 6'4". They could have made it work, but there was never one taken. At this juncture, I'd just like to read you some excerpts from that cover of Harper's Weekly we saw, with some closer-up views of a few of the photographs reproduced there. That first one on the left is Mrs. Mumler with the spirit. The other two are unidentified in the article. So the text reads in part, quote, "The case of the people against William H. Mumler is one so remarkable and without precedent in the annals of criminal jurisprudence that we devote this page to illustrations bearing upon it. The charge against Mr. Mumler is that, by means of what he terms spiritual photographs, he has swindled many credulous persons, leading them to believe it possible to photograph the immaterial forms of their departed friends. The case has excited profound interest, and strange as it may seem, there are thousands of people who believe that its development will justify the claims made by the spirit photographer. If there is a trick in Mr. Mumler's process, it has certainly not been detected as yet. To all appearances, spiritual photography rests just where the wrappings and table turnings have rested for some years. Those who believe in it at all will respect no opposing arguments, and disbelievers will reject every favorable hypothesis or explanation. Mr. Mumler has certainly been very fortunate. He has been believed in the first place by a large number of people. He has obtained, again, a good price for his photographs. For who could expect spirits to be called from the vasty deep for less than $10 per head? In fact, there are a few ways to achieve a spirit photograph. You could photograph on top of an existing photo to create a double exposure, or you could have an actor quietly step in behind a sitter to make a quick exposure before quietly stepping out of the frame again. However, Mumler's photo of Mary and Abraham remains a mystery because Lincoln was never photographed in that exact position, and the hands are too large, arms too short, and he was much taller. But spiritualism was to have one more major effect on Mary's life. Robert, her eldest son, had become increasingly worried about and embarrassed by his mother's odd behavior. Her eccentricities went far beyond her spiritualism, and there is little doubt that Mary's behavior at times was exceedingly strange. Robert and David Davis, the executor of Abraham's estate, worried that Mary's attachment to spiritualism would result in her being robbed or scammed. In combination with other things, Mary's assertions during the 1873 to 74 season that she had heard voices and rappings and that Abraham's spirit had told her she would die soon convinced Robert that his mother was insane. In May 1875, Robert had Mary escorted to the courthouse in Chicago and tried before a jury of 12 men on the charge of insanity, which was required by Illinois law before commitment. She was very quickly found to be insane and then confined to Bellevue Place, a private sanitarium. Spiritualism was never mentioned explicitly during the trial or during her confinement at Bellevue, but letters reveal it was clearly a factor in Robert's opinion of Mary's mental state. It was also clearly a factor in the minds of the witnesses, especially doctors, who testified against her, and the jury who declared her insane. The Chicago Times noted the quote fact that she was a confirmed spiritualist when reporting the trial, and the medical literature of the time frequently linked spiritualism with insanity, especially in women. For example, Dr. W.A. Hammond explained in Spiritualism and Allied Causes and Conditions of Nervous Derangement of 1876, quote, the false sensuous impressions conjured up by mediums force too much blood to the brain and eventually predispose seance seekers to lunacy. This lunacy was called theomania and what the doctor at Bellevue diagnosed as morbid mental manifestations fit the bill. Mary's life did not end in the sanitarium, however. With the help of friends who were not spiritualists, though Robert accused them of it, she was released into her sister Elizabeth's care after nearly 4 months at Bellevue. Robert continued to worry about her mental state and especially about her association with spiritualists. He asserted that spiritualists in Chicago had acquired some of Mary's property. Elizabeth said no. Elizabeth insisted that Mary was indifferent to spiritualism. Robert, however, insisted, she hardly thinks of anything else, and almost her only companions are spiritualists. David Davis concurred. He said that she, Elizabeth, has no conception of your mother's real condition and evidently does not believe that spiritualism has anything to do with it, while you and I know differently. Despite Robert's best efforts, a second insanity trial in June 1876 found Mary to be sane. And as soon as she regained control of her property, which had been under Robert's conservatorship, Mary returned to Europe. She remained there until ill health forced her home to her sister's home in Springfield in 1880. The following year, she traveled to health resorts in Canada and New York, returning to Springfield the following year in 82. There, on July 16, 1882, Mary Lincoln died at her sister Elizabeth's home, seen here. Mary's funeral was held in the First Presbyterian Church, where a large floral display spelled out the spiritualist phrase, "The pearly gates ajar." And she was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery with her family at the Lincoln tomb pictured here. Today, many historians and critics condemn Mary Lincoln for her beliefs in contact with the spirit world. But the truth is, we all turn to anything we can to seek comfort during trying times. Spiritualism played a pivotal role during the 19th century, and it gave Americans the chance to say goodbye to loved ones in a time of high mortality rates. In 1860, the average U.S. life expectancy was 39 years. In 1865, nearly 325 children died for every 1,000 by the age of 5. And an average of 1 in 5 soldiers lost their lives during the war, 2 in 4 of which were from disease rather than battle. Thank you for your time today. You can reach me at lincoln@acpl.info, and be sure to check out our Facebook page. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Abby.
All right, Jessie, thank you so much for that presentation. That was wonderful. If anybody does have any questions, you guys can go ahead and put those in the chat, or I'm sorry, in the Q&A, not the chat. And we'll get to those. So let's see here. Okay, we do have a question. How many seances did Abraham Lincoln attend? Oh, we don't hear you. You're muted.
Thank you.
Yep.
So history can't be certain, but we know that he attended at least 4 seances with Mary during the White House years in an effort to look out for her.
Wonderful. Let's see. So what happened to Mary's copy of the spirit photo captured by Mumler?
So there's no evidence to say one way or the other, but we here in the Rolland Center believe it's likely that Robert burned it along with other sensitive family documents or letters after his mother's death.
Let's see. How did the insanity trial affect Mary and Robert's relationship?
Well, it certainly strained it, that's for sure. The two became distanced. It wasn't until Mary's first grandbaby, Robert and his wife's Mary's first child. Their first child was again a Mary. There's lots of Marys in this family story. But they called the baby Mamie. So when Mamie came along, that was when the two started to repair their relationship, Robert and his mother.
Do you know who got the records from Bellevue for Mary's stay?
I do not know. We have some records here from that stay, what we call the insanity file. It's lots of letters and documents from that period, but I'm not sure if there's another location that has more records from Bellevue. We can look into that.
Let's see here. Do you know when spiritualism fell out of fashion?
So its popularity started to fall off in about the 1880s as the movement faced increased challenges to its credibility. However, it remained influential through about 1920. But there are still active spiritualists today. Some are independent groups and some are organized formally under various spiritualist churches.
That kind of answers the next question a little bit, but not completely. I don't know if you'll know this one, but do you know where spiritualist organizations are centered today?
I do not. My first guess would be in the most popular centers of, where it was at its height in the 1800s. So I would look to New York, but certainly it could be anywhere across the country, and I'm not familiar. Again, I could look into that.
It looks like that might be all of our questions for today. I wanted to thank you again, Jessie. And in the chat, if you do have any other questions that you think about later, you can always email us. And I will go ahead and put our email in the chat as well. Let's see. All right. Well, I think then that is all we have time for today. Jessie, thank you again so much. And to our audience, thank you everyone for coming. It is great having you here. And again, we'll be doing another program, another Zoom program in February. So we look forward to seeing you. And if you're in the Fort Wayne area, don't forget to come in and see the exhibits that we have here in the Rolland Center. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Abby.